It seems that there is some concern among the pregnancy community or people related or concerned about pregnancy and COVID vaccines. And this was from a study that has recently been put out as a preprint. Important to note, perception of COVID vaccination during pregnancy in a cohort of the US adults in 2023. Now, the first thing that I noticed is that it's 2023. Why did they delay this study until then? Because the implications are quite interesting, certainly from a public health point of view. And this paper interrupted me, meaning that I was busy preparing for my next event, which is coming up on Thursday. If you are interested, looking at spike protein reactivation on HIV. This is a look not specifically just at HIV, but it's looking at other latent viruses, the herpes viruses, especially Epstein-Barr, CMV, cytomegalovirus, and seeing whether or not the mechanisms that seem to be suggested in this paper could overlap and explain some of the unusual patterns of viral reactivations we have been seeing. So if you are interested, look in the description below. You'll see the link. Join me in the next few days. I'll continue to talk about it as we look at the science. So getting back to this topic here, this paper, as I said, it seems unusual that it came out so late. And you can see here, again, COVID vaccination perception in 2023. It was done in the United States. You can see the USA here for all the affiliations, primarily in the New York region. And they were just looking at a number of factors, which I'll come back to in just a second. They were looking at a number of factors with regards to how the vaccine was perceived among the general community, and specifically among women who were likely or needed to be vaccinated. Now, when they looked at this, and in up to December of 2024, they had included this in the paper. Despite its benefits, only 13% of pregnant women in the US had received their updated 2024-25 vaccine by December 2024. And when they looked at the perception, you can see here that less than half, 40%, perceived COVID vaccine safe, the vaccine as being safe during pregnancy. Now, just look at these two numbers a minute. 13% only took the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, yet 40% perceived that it was safe during pregnancy. So this straight away caught my attention because I thought to myself, actually, 40% seems pretty high. 13% seems more like what I would expect. So where did the 40% come from? And so this is now where you have to really look at the paper. And I think the authors should have made this very clear at the beginning or in their summary, that who were they looking at when they asked this question. So I'm going to show you a section in the paper in one of the tables that will give you the answer to what is going on. Here we go. So one of the tables here, I'll show you what the table looks like in terms of the heading, and it was about the table 6, participant characteristics by perception towards COVID vaccine concerns during pregnancy among all the participants. They had 4,488 people who completed that, and you can see here they are from multiple age categories. The highest was in the age group 30 to 39, and so male versus female, primarily slightly more females, 53%. And so when you look at this cohort, there's a very important piece of information that was not included overtly. When you look at their vaccination status, and you can see it here, vaccination status, 99% of those in this cohort were vaccinated, 96%. So this is primarily a vaccinated cohort who the majority were boosted in 2023. So you can start to see, and again, even if you look at their household members, up to 96% in this section here, this is a vaccinated cohort that they're looking at. And so the 40% that they are speaking about is in the vaccinated cohort. And this is what's very interesting. And you have to remember that when you're looking at this table here, um, when you're looking at the table here, not only is the vaccination status significant, but also when you look at their trust in public health institutions. Yes, 90% of them who were in agreement and trusted it, 84% who had some uncertainty, 56% who were disagreeing trusted their public health institutions. But you can see that a significant proportion of this population had trust in public health institutions. So they trusted the public health institutions, they were vaccinated, yet only 40% said that they thought that vaccinations were actually going to be beneficial in the context of pregnancy. And when you look specifically at why this is complicated, here we have one of those statements in the paper. A 2022 global review found no major mRNA vaccine adverse events among pregnant women and confirmed their effectiveness preventing severe disease. So if you have technically no adverse events and effective against severe disease, it should be a no-brainer that everybody would therefore want to get vaccinated, especially if they are pregnant and therefore at higher risk. So here are the kind of questions that they were asking them. And you can see here, we assessed the perception of COVID-19 vaccine safety and efficacy during pregnancy in December of 2023 using responses to 5 specific statements. One of them is A, not enough known about the long-term side effects of receiving COVID-19 vaccines in pregnancy. B, 19 vaccines in pregnancy. C, the COVID-19 vaccine is safe to receive during pregnancy. D, the COVID vaccine reduces the risk of severe COVID-19 during pregnancy. And E, receiving the COVID-19 vaccine while pregnant helps protect infants until they're old enough to be vaccinated. So this was a study looking at the vaccinated cohorts, looking at their perception of the safety of COVID vaccines in pregnancy. Now, I'm going to share with you some thoughts from my point of view, and it's important to note this is just my view. I have to be careful here. I'm not trying to go against public health advice, but I'm just trying to make some very clear statements here. There is no way to know the long-term safety when you haven't reached long-term. That's one of the first principles. And so anyone who says long-term safety in relation to a novel technology, a novel virus, is, in my view, not being truthful. You can say that we have not as yet identified any specific problems, but we do recognize that there could be issues in the longer term if there are areas that we don't fully understand with regards to the science. I think that's a more honest answer rather than saying, no, there are no problems. And so it's very important that my advice is to try and be scientifically honest, because the people can see through it. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that when you say, listen, there are no problems, and they're thinking to themselves, well, how would you know? Because we're only just 5 years, 5 years down the line, and we haven't had a lot of studies. So how are you so absolutely sure? And so this is the kind of thing that I think damages scientific credibility, and we need more honesty. That's my view. It's not whether or not something works. You just have to be very clear about when you say something is beneficial. Make sure to say when you don't know, where are the gaps in your knowledge? What are the bits that you don't quite understand? My personal perspective was at the time that they needed to be targeted in their recommendation in pregnancy. Pregnancy is one of those things you don't want to mess around with. We had the thalidomide scandal in the 1960s, and so you really have to be careful about introducing new stuff in relation to pregnancy. And I thought that the very broad recommendation in pregnancy was unusual, especially because when we think of pregnancy, we knew from the data, from the demographics, the highest risk were in older women, women with comorbidities, hypertension, diabetes, obesity in pregnancy. That was where the risk was highest. It wasn't that there was no risk across all of pregnancy, but they did a blanket statement giving the impression that the risk was the same across the pregnancies. I thought that was a mistake. You target, it can't be the same. A 35-year-old first pregnancy, overweight, hypertension, and diabetes with obesity is not the same as a 22-year-old who had no comorbidities and no complications in the pregnancy. And so, therefore, you should do a risk assessment to try and work out whether or not there is a benefit on a risk. That's my thought on it. Additionally, and I'm going to show you a slide here in terms of the science, because I think it's important to get the science right. When we were looking at the details about understanding severe COVID or the whole spectrum of COVID, I broke it down into a number of sections. And here we have the full spectrum based on my research. A lot of people were asymptomatic and they had no symptoms whatsoever. Now, truthfully, if you looked at their scans, you would probably find some inflammation in the lung, but they were better called subclinical. Then, certainly with Omicron, you had some people who had a bronchitis, very bad cough, dry cough that went on sometimes for 100 days. Then you had the viral pneumonia. Okay, now this is important to differentiate because if you have inflammation in the lungs and reduced oxygen exchange in somebody who has any compromise, they can present with oxygen problems and end up in hospital. Then you had moderate COVID, viral pneumonia plus microclotting, and severe COVID was a viral pneumonia plus a lot of microclotting. Okay, within that spectrum, now this is important to understand. Within that spectrum of presentation, part of the reason why in pregnancy you had higher risk, and the risk was a lot in the third trimester, because in the third trimester, that is when the baby is biggest. There's that much more fluid in the uterus, and it's compressing the lungs. They can't use abdominal breathing so well, and so they have less capability to expand their lungs. And so in that cohort, even if they had a viral pneumonia, where if they weren't pregnant, they wouldn't have significant symptoms or not too many, you may find that they struggle needing oxygen to be in hospital. Now, they found that in the context of vaccination, it's important to acknowledge exactly what they said in terms of the paper. When they looked at the bigger studies, looking at the outcomes in terms of vaccinations, they found that there was a significant reduction in terms of hospitalization for women who were vaccinated. I think that's down to reducing the severe COVID-19 in the higher risk cohorts and potentially maybe reducing the viral pneumonia. I still think that even with that knowledge, there should have been far more selective approach to how the vaccine was used. And my position has always been that the spike protein, you don't play around with it. It can bind to many other proteins. It can trigger autoimmune responses. It can get stuck in tissues and immune cells. You should always want to reduce the exposure of spike protein to as many people as you can. And so if somebody already had immunity and were less likely to have a virus breaking through and getting into their bloodstream, you don't want to be putting spike protein in their systemic circulation for any good reason. That's how I look at the science. And so my perspective may be different from others. But even with that in mind, what we're seeing here from this paper is that within a vaccinated cohort, 99% almost, I think it was 98.5% vaccinated, this cohort, only 40% of them actually thought it was safe to give COVID vaccines in pregnancy in 2023. That is quite significant in terms of public health challenges, because it is not so clear. It's not clear going forward. Looking at, let me just show you this here. Is enough known about the long-term side effects for receiving COVID vaccine during pregnancy? 30% were in agreement. 37.8% were uncertain. 32% disagreed. That is very, very significant. And I think that on balance, there needs to be a lot more clarity, because if people who have already taken the vaccine, and this is important, and you would presume the majority of them, because they were then boosted, were not necessarily forced to do this. They did this primarily of their own volition. They were concerned about COVID. They believed in the vaccine. They believe in public health, but they still don't trust that you should give it in pregnancy. That, to me, is a significant factor. Only 40% of them said they felt sure or they had no concerns about this happening. And when you look broadly across the population, only 13% of women in 2024, I don't know what it was like in terms of 2025, but only 13% actually went on to get the vaccine. I think that at this point with Omicron, I'm not sure whether or not the recommendations should be the same. I think that they should reassess the demographics as to who is getting severe disease, and recognizing that the vaccine doesn't actually necessarily stop transmission. And so you have to be careful as to what you're looking at, and that the pandemic continues to transition, and therefore recommendations should follow along with it, which to some extent they have done. So overall, we have a situation here that, one, I think this paper should have been published much earlier. This should have been out in 2024, maybe at least 2025, if they got information up to 2024. I don't know why they delayed it for so long, because this is not a complex study. It wouldn't have been that they had a lot of details to look at. So that's the news for today. Still a lot of work to be done, and I still think that this is going to damage long-term trust, not only in all vaccines, but in health, science, and medicine in the longer term. We're going to have to do some recovery work to try and rebuild confidence in actual science. As a final reminder, remember that coming up in the next few days is looking at an important paper about how spike protein could reactivate HIV. I'm using that to therefore extrapolate it to other viral infections that can be latent, whether or not the same mechanisms could be relevant. Shingles, Epstein-Barr, herpes. That is the most important question. What are the characteristics? Are there any strategies that can be used to protect? Have a great evening. Look forward to bringing you more information in the near future.
A hero, an immune adventure. Humming Heroes, your lyrical guide to the body's defenders. Now on Amazon. Check the links below.